On October 31st, 1938, up-and-coming actor and soon-to-be director Orson Welles produced a radio show adaptation of the acclaimed alien invasion novel War of the Worlds. If you're familiar with this story, you'll know where it goes from here. That, on listening to the program, many of the audience unfamiliar with the science fiction original concluded from it that UFOs had in fact arrived on the planet and had begun unceremoniously exterminating the human race en masse. With hindsight, and particularly with the mindset of the interconnected world we live in today, the idea of being duped like this might seem silly. You might recall the anecdote of how, when the Lumiere brothers' 1896 Arrival of a Train played in theatres, one of the earliest silent films, the sight of a train hurtling directly towards the screen caused many to rise up from their seats and flee for fear that what was happening was real. This seems in line with that. But when it comes to these prepackaged stories, handed down through time, things are never that simple. Indeed, there's very little evidence that Arrival on the Train caused anyone in the audience to have had that reaction. While certainly terrifying patrons in its authenticity, there isn't really anything to substantiate the idea that they were literally running screaming out of the theatre, screaming bloody murder. It is, at its heart, more of an evocative representative image than an authentic account. In the case of War of the Worlds' 1938 broadcast, there is more to suggest listeners were genuinely convinced and horrified by what they were hearing. What gets missed out here is why exactly this gave them that reaction. Radio broadcasted fiction, while not completely unheard of, was certainly more of a rarity at the time. To further obfuscate this, Wilde had deliberately employed techniques to aid in convincing listeners of the broadcast authenticity. It was as if he had challenged himself to try and convince people. Not only did Wilde convert the dainty Victorian-era suburban England setting to contemporary Americana, but even in format the show was masked. A series of news bulletins interrupted what seemed to be any other evening's broadcast, first announcing a strange object had landed in a farm in New Jersey, then its investigation by local police, the escalation of the threat as strange beings emerged and a conflict broke out, and eventually a full-scale invasion of New York City, complete with clouds of toxic gas being spewed out by alien warships. Now, those who caught the opening and closing of the broadcast would likely be clued into the artificiality of the whole thing. It literally starts with an admission by Welles that this is an adaptation, and by the end of it all gets pretty theatrical and hard to follow as straightforward news reporting.
As I set down these notes on paper, I'm obsessed by the thought that I may be the last living man on Earth.
This, maybe as a consequence of the fact that there really isn't the expectation in radio that the listener will be taking in the whole, complete work at once, failed to prevent the chaos that would ensue. While its original broadcast made national headlines, reruns and translations of Welles' adaptation would continue to cause public hysteria, culminating in a Spanish-language version broadcast in Quito, Ecuador, which reportedly led to the mass disruption of police and fire brigade services as misinformed listeners called in, and eventually a riot as the public attacked the radio station, having discovered that they'd been tricked. The station was burned down, and at least 7 lives were lost in the incident, including those of the translator's girlfriend and nephew. In the phrase tricked, we're left with a question. What is the moral responsibility of those involved in this whole affair? To what extent do we blame Welles for the panic and tragedy that would come as a result of this broadcast? Despite this event having occurred over 80 years ago, this is still a line we are extraordinarily fuzzy on, even as controversies frequently arise as we declare that somebody's crossed it.
Does the fact that the broadcast eventually veers into something less realistic absolve him of responsibility, even if the first half was clearly modelled after genuine news?
Does the fact that Welles left an explicit disclaimer absolve him, even if he knew full well there was a chance listeners could miss it? Was it never his problem to begin with, and the responsibility solely on the radio station which gave him the go-ahead to broadcast? Can the station even be blamed? Or does this responsibility lie with the public? Are we asking that they treat every piece of news they receive with a degree of skepticism, and thereby shifting to any blame to them when they are fooled? The aesthetic of reality, or at least authenticity, is powerful. In fiction, we often measure value by what feels real, what's called verisimilitude, even if we know it's not, and we revel at the opportunity to peek into the lives of real people on YouTube or reality television, even though we're aware that we are being given a product, not true reality.
This is the best day of my life.
All of this, yet sometimes we still feel lied to. Today I come not with a definitive answer because, well, all signs point to this not being a straightforward problem with a straightforward solution. What I come with today are a series of examples relating to the practice of false reality. I'm going to be diving into these examples, critically analysing them, and then ultimately leaving you to decide what you feel is or is not okay, why, and what we can do about it. I'm also, yes, going to be including the thing what I did that kind of represents all of these problems rolled into one. I encourage viewers to peek into the comments section and disclose their conclusions once we reach the end. With all that in mind, let's get real. Monster Week is an annual tradition held every May on the channel Animal Planet, a popular event that sees a wave of new programs and documentaries, usually based on investigating some strange and ferocious beasts the audience may not be familiar with.
Wow, look at that!
In many ways, it's representative of the transition of the channel as a whole. Fearing declining ratings and anxious investors, Animal Planet is now infamous for its open adoption of more speculative, dramatised programming, from soap opera style reality shows about the life and times of animals living in a zoo.
The commandos have found Marilyn at home, alone.
To undercover investigations of creatures they don't want you to know about. Animal Planet has been pushing that boat out in a desperate attempt to fit itself in, you guessed it, the capitalist structure. Little did they know that on Monster Week 2011, Animal Planet took it too far. If by took it too far, they mean took it too far to the bank. Some features on Animal Planet would take real study and research and trump it up a bit, make a bit of a story out of it. Some features would maybe stretch that truth a tad more, maybe take some of its conclusions from the speculation of less than reputable sources. Mermaids the bodies found? Well, with mermaids, they just straight up fabricated the whole thing.
So, what else on Earth would be smart enough to communicate with dolphins? What else is out there?
Mermaids had been advertised much like any of Animal Planet's docs on cryptids and paranormal creatures, a study into the unknown which offers new evidence you may not have seen. Mermaids uses a combination of hired actors and poorly aging CG animation to conjure up a convincing argument for the aquatic ape theory, which suggests the human genetic family branched off back into the seas many millennia ago. If you missed the incredibly sparse disclaimers announcing the work was essentially just gussied up science fiction, well, it was somewhat convincing. It looked and acted like a straight documentary, and millions were fooled as the show wound up being the most successful on the network. Animal Planet was, obviously, reticent to be too forward about clarifying the nature of the show. Where they could have inserted a more obvious disclaimer on reruns, they chose not to, and looking at those ratings, it's easy to see why. The novelty of the event rested very much on this premise of possibly being real. The show even includes fabricated statements and documents suggesting how and why the whole thing had been covered up, and it built this whole mystique around the whole feature that caused quite the national stir. You know, like how people were asserting the Blair Witch Project was actual found footage, or Paranormal Activities was based on a real story, or how Slendy Man really is a very tall man who lives in the woods, and that thing again, that authenticity, that sense of the real, that verisimilitude, it was intoxicating, far, far more than if the show had been explicitly advertised as fiction. Of course, when the dust settled and people started to realise how unconvincing that CGI actually was, they were more than a little upset. So what made them upset? The obvious answer is that they were given something that superficially looked like one thing, but was actually something else. But I mean, this is an Animal Planet documentary about mermaids, right?
Is there really going to be such an assumption that everything you'll be shown is 100% fact? It's not uncommon for sensationalist work like this to go off something as tenuous as recreations based on random eyewitness accounts. Is what is essentially a story told by a guy who might have just wanted to be on TV really that much more credible than something that was completely scripted? I mean, is that really any different than if I told you, yeah, the writers actually heard the story from a friend and then wrote the script based on that? And for sure, some things in the show were actual things at least. The bloop was a real thing. They didn't know where it came from. I guess it could have been mermaids. Turned out to just be an iceberg cracking, so there's that. If we accept that a clear enough disclaimer would have solved the problem, are we now expecting this from any work of fiction using the aesthetic of reality? Do I need big bold letters on the screen reading, "This is not a real movie," every time I throw on Borat or my favourite film, Area 51? In theory, I absolutely could tune in halfway through these movies where none of these disclaimers are there, but this seems like it'd surely spoil a whole genre if the audience is being constantly reminded of the artificiality of what they were watching. Being pulled out of it, as it were. And yet, there must be a reason why overwhelmingly found footage fiction is just entertainment, but this was a lie. To offer a possible answer, let's ask everyone's favourite YouTube fantasy killjoy.
Greetings children, it's me, Captain Disillusion.
In this video by online magic debunker Captain Disillusion, the Cap is discussing a trick pulled by a university student over at the Rochester Institute of Technology, a video of an apparent reality-bending fixture known as the Asherian Stairwell. Long story short, you go up the stairs, you end up at the bottom of the stairs, and it's all just a trick of the eye, a design quirk, an optical illusion. Oh, and also completely made up and really just the result of a bunch of obscure camera tricks observed by the Captain in his debunking. Like most of the subjects of this series, it's an odd position as far as magic, as the creator of the stairwell trick outright admitted the whole thing was a fake, in the very description of the video and in any comments that question him on it. So I guess in that case, he's kind of in the clear, right? I mean, if we don't expect people doing magic tricks just to tell you outright that they're using a weird prop in a weird way to make you think there's a person being chopped in half or something, why would we admonish a filmmaker who does go the extra mile? Disillusion goes another way of it.
A myth is a story, shaped by culture over time. It has a moral, a point it tries to communicate. The notion that a college somewhere in America is home to a physically impossible stairwell is just a lie. I think I understand what you were trying to do. I'm just having a hard time figuring out why.
Kat points out that, even if it's extremely unlikely creator Michael Lacanilau had any real malicious intent, the video did still fool and continues to fool a lot of people, and even suggests that in needlessly perpetuating this kind of study, Michael was in effect perpetuating the narrative of fake news. And there's the thing, needlessly. Disillusion searches for a kind of moral justification for the event, and is unconvinced by his answer, that Michael simply wanted to insert some childlike joy into people's hearts and make them believe the impossible could be possible again. Kat points out that, well, if he just wanted to do that, he should have just come up with a good story instead of trying to mislead people. What he did instead was pure spectacle, dishonesty, just a lie. But like, that's what most magic is also? Magic shows are a thing we all kind of acknowledge as possibly, probably not entirely authentic, but the appeal is still in shattering the illusion of reality. And if literally admitting it was all editing tricks isn't enough, I mean, why isn't this very video by Captain Disillusion also at fault here? I don't think that portal gun was really real. What was the reason behind that? Was it possibly just a fun way to illustrate a point Cap was making, to give the audience a bit of that magical joy? But I don't know, man, maybe I could be tricked by it. It could happen. And then you're just telling a lie with Sony Vegas, or Premiere, I don't know. In any case, Cap doesn't feel he can find a good enough reason for Michael to justify his film, and that brings us back to mermaids. So, could it be the problem with mermaids is it doesn't have a good enough reason to justify its existence as a hoax? Possibly. It's not an uncommon response. Writing for Wired, Brian Swittock wrote, "Speculative biology can be a lot of fun. to wonder how different forms of life might have evolved, and with the right context and presentation, mermaids could have been a unique way to highlight evolutionary and biological ideas. But rather than being a hook for communicating actual science, mermaids was a sensationalistic end in itself. And in the way the documentary plays out, it really doesn't work as a direct commentary on some other real-world thing, like how, say, District 9 is an overt commentary on apartheid, and incidentally tries a lot less to trick the audience than Mermaids does. I actually felt the whole time that this could have been a fantastic analogy for climate change. The mermaids analogous for this mysterious natural force which we are disrupting and may therefore become a threat to us, but it doesn't benefit the corporations and the government to tell us too much about it. Look, even the bloop, the key piece of evidence of mermaids in the dock, it's actually a thing that may or may not be the result of climate change. But this isn't really pushed by the documentary at all, and long stretches don't serve this analogy in the slightest. This hasn't stopped some people, of course, drawing some greater meaning out of it. Journey over to the average YouTube comments section on the feature, and lo and behold at how many simply do not want to believe this is fake. They believe so much in this that they insist actually Animal Planet was made by some shadowy government force to declare it fake. Maybe they're harvesting the mermaids for a secret cure to cancer, I don't know. But also, why wouldn't they have these kinds of theories? The complication here is that if you do try to draw any meaning out of mermaids, the most obvious message is we shouldn't trust the government. They're the ones used as the narrative scapegoat in the feature. It's repeatedly claimed that it's in their interest to cover this stuff up. In a way, it's a premise which defeats its own disclaimer, because of course a documentary that really exposes the government is immediately going to be labelled a fake, right? Even while many acknowledge that multiple aspects of the documentary are constructed, like those aforementioned CGI segments, people still desire to believe in a deeper truth to the film. What this leads me to is that if there being a clear artistic or political point you could draw from mermaids somewhat absolves it as a lie in need of moral justification, that could actually be kind of worrying. Because if we can say to ourselves that it may not be the truth, but that it still speaks the truth, what does that say about our grasp on truth? If we say to ourselves that we can accept material which falsely imitates reality as long as it's for a good reason and not only to mislead, and that mermaids could qualify for that, how far down this road can we go? Up to this point, we've been kind of working through our thinking in terms of these false realities, why capital incentivizes pushing this line, how highlighting this artifice isn't always enough. Now we're onto the idea that the reason must be good enough to justify the dupe. It's got to get you thinking. Well, what I've got here is a kind of false reality you might not think about when it comes to this topic. In the fall of 2008, Sarah Palin was big news. From seemingly out of nowhere, the relatively young and fiery Alaskan governor had been given the nod to serve as vice presidential nominee alongside John McCain, and she was well into her time on the campaign trail. Having given dozens of interviews, likely lined up to do dozens more, Palin was set up for a chat with ABC News on September the 11th. Most famous now is the moment in this interview wherein Palin is asked about her feelings on Russian political relations to the US, to which Palin abruptly responded, "I can see Russia from my house." And we all had a good laugh at this kind of strange comment, a treasure in a pretty mind-numbing election. Except, well, that didn't really happen, did it? Despite it being the line Palin is perhaps most famous for nowadays, Palin never actually said that at all. Her actual observation was that these relations were important to her as an Alaska representative. Considering Alaska and the Russian border are so close, it's possible to see it across the coastline. Not from her house, just on a clear day looking out on the shore, and turns out she was right. Still a bit of an odd comment, but like I say, there's a lot of interviews. So where does this line come from? Well, it was actually made by someone who publicly impersonated Sarah Palin so that she could use fabricated statements to make her look stupid. Was a great wrong committed here? Oh no, it was just SNL.
And I can see Russia from my house.
Now it goes without saying that there was plenty worth criticising about Palin without relying on made-up statements. She was, after all, the one who pushed the whole death panel thing, asserting Barack Obama's healthcare reforms would lead to the state deciding to execute the sick and elderly. But at the end of the day, it was the Tina Fey characterization of Palin and a few choice photoshops commonly confused for reality that cultivated a lasting image of who this politician was. It did make her feel more silly and outlandish to people, and it did have an effect on how she was viewed. Not because it captured the truth of who she was, but the truth of people's image of what she was. If Captain Disillusion was pulling the verdict here, this was also all just a lie, and a dangerous precedent in an era where the context can be removed from any fiction. The answer? Cancel SNL. In all seriousness, I bring up this example specifically because I'd say generally comedic impersonations are pretty far down the low end when people talk about the dangerous precedent of fake news. Unless you're the President of the United States. Comedy in general is a very good way to avoid this kind of criticism, as I partially touched on in my dead political meme video. It's a way, not necessarily to argue against your opponent, but to reframe how they're perceived to the wider public. SNL, and indeed most political impersonation types, do tend to target all sides to varying degrees. Even in the Palin skit I referred to, she's right there next to Amy Poehler's desperate, power-hungry, vaguely misogynistic Hillary Clinton. So it's not even necessarily about partisanship. But whether or not there is a pointed political agenda, or if the purpose is only to entertain, the effect is the same. It's a conjured version of a group or a figure that is going to leave a lasting impact on the public consciousness. Observe the number of people that imagine vegans as these moralistic virtue signalers who just can't wait to lecture you on why you're the devil for eating meat. Most of these people didn't get that because they know a lot of vegans and they all act that way, but because of a comedic media portrayal. I've spoken about it before on this channel, but how many backwards, redneck, shotgun-wielding conservatives have a lot of LA liberals really interacted with? Yet, we still wind up imagining our opponents in this way, either as incidental to harmless comedy, or as a direct attempt to reframe a position. All this to say, the fact that these kinds of false realities, these impersonations and parodies, may or may not be making a point, does not necessarily absolve them of theoretical fault. In fact, them using false realities to make a specific political argument might even make this an even murkier conversation. Political commentator Alex Jones describes himself as an entertainer. If we take his reporting work as entertainment, if we add an Onion-style disclaimer to his site Infowars reading, "This is entertainment," would that absolve them of fault for the demonstrably fake news peddled by that site? Whether we disclose it or not, when we use the aesthetic of reality to tell a story or to make a point, the risk is always there for it to be taken and ran with. A random college student was able to genuinely convince thousands of people he'd found a magical staircase that warps you downstairs when you go upstairs. Animal Planet literally said their documentary was a fake, and people still insist it's all true. A radio station was burned down because thousands of listeners felt lied to about a piece of fiction presented as a newsreel. Verisimilitude without clear purpose is designated as a lie, which feeds into the fake news narrative. With clear purpose, it can be seen as even worse. And I guess it's time to chat about my own contribution. In October, I put out The Massacre of Martin III, a video essay telling the tale of a public-private partnership gone horribly wrong, of corporate monopolies and the manipulation of the public, how social media can be used to cultivate a narrative, how we can alienate each other in times when the real cause of our concerns can feel too distant, too impossible to challenge. It was, as I say, a tale, a work of fiction, meant to communicate many of my own personal grievances with our current systems in the same way you might with a film or a novel. At the time, I thought that was very clever. It gave such an immediate feeling of authenticity to the work that helped make the events detailed feel all the more tangible. This came through to most of the people that watched the video. It scared them, the extent to which what I'd written drew them to real stories, be it national news or their own personal experiences. How close this horror felt to their reality deepened their appreciation of the text. And I felt good. And then I got a message. It was a message from someone who, up to this point, had been a fan of my content. They were horrified and fairly disgusted by what I'd done. I can't find the exact messages anymore, and I really wouldn't want to, and I really don't want anyone going after this person. But the gist was that they felt I'd played with their emotions, that I had needlessly tricked them, that, particularly as my work had up to this point been looking at real things, it was incredibly irresponsible of me to just drop this out there with only one minor disclaimer, which I left in the description and comments, not in the video itself, because I felt doing so would spoil the immersion. My thinking was much like what I said earlier, with the Blair Witch Project or paranormal activities. There isn't this expectation that this is a fake thing be emblazoned on screen at all times to prevent your art being misconstrued. I just felt like I could use a novel format to tell a story that would hopefully resonate with people. The most basic level of research would reveal this whole thing was made up, all the companies and individuals involved completely fabricated, and that was how I justified it to myself. I got quite defensive. I felt like in criticizing me, they were in some way attacking the potential of art. Again, I got compliments about the fact that my video felt real to these people. The authenticity was what drew them in. Was this person now saying I wasn't allowed to make something that felt real for fear that people could confuse it for fake news? I was accused of contributing to that narrative. The point was even made that I would be hurting those who agreed with my observations, as critics could point to this and say, look, they have to make things up to feel oppressed. And at that point the conversation ended on pretty bad terms. If the person I'd spoken to is watching this, I'm sorry that I was so quick to jump on the defensive. Know that, if you hadn't raised your objection, I might never have really questioned my assumption that the line between what is or is not an acceptable false reality was fairly straightforward, because it isn't. As I've hopefully demonstrated here, just making sure you leave some notice saying the thing you're putting out there is fiction or fun isn't always enough to prevent people from feeling lied to, or even prevent people from being influenced by what you've said, even as you highlight that it's artificial. In art, it is often the intent to influence people's thinking through this artificiality. I think ultimately this all comes from the fact that there's one sentiment I came to feel uncomfortable with, and it's one I've seen come up quite a bit in my comments there. It didn't happen, but it feels like it could. It has, I have to admit, made me feel uncomfortable with my work in fiction in some ways, especially fiction which pushes that line of authenticity to the point that it could be easily misconstrued as reality. For the longest time, I felt that an artistic work's ability to make a sound and specific argument, that's a quality that uplifts a creative piece. I know many people who literally define art as something created to make a point, but I think this conversation is getting more complicated, and I think we should more seriously consider that topic moving forward. Fake news has become a common phrase in the last couple of years, but it remains vague in the minds of many people. Public figures declare as fake news what can be provable as fact, but also what may simply be misinformed reporting, what may even declare itself as false. The President of the United States can refer to unfavourable late-night impersonations of him as unfair reporting. Meanwhile, he gets elected on a campaign fueled by blatant misrepresentations of his opponents built on character assassination rather than responding to any real political points.
Please clap.
Jeb wasn't begging people to clap, he was making a joke because earlier in the speech, the audience kept clapping and he had to ask them to stop, which meant when he was actually done, they didn't know that it was time to clap, so he made a joke, he said, please clap, as a joke referencing that, and like that's one of the main things people think of now when they think of Jeb. A 5-second clip taken out of context. Justice for Jeb. We are all influenced by false realities, be they manipulations of the truth or outright fabrications we fail to see through. We all look for truth, not necessarily to people, but to the idea of people, and in the same way not necessarily truth to events, but truth to the idea behind an event. Much like the audience running screaming from the movie theatre on seeing the train roll through, it speaks to a truth. This technology was new and scary, and it impacted these people far more than it would to us today. There are many ways this conversation can go. In all honesty, as I thought more and more about this topic, the threads of things to consider just started to multiply, but I I feel like if I follow all these threads now, I'll end up with something a little aimless, or, well, more aimless. As I said at the start, I don't have a concrete answer to this question. Where is the line between acceptable and unacceptable falseness, and what makes something cross it? Much like that first critical comment to my fiction, I just want you to maybe consider turning that dial from judge to observe, and think about where your line is and why. We'll take this as an introduction to this topic, a bit of an episode 1. While I do admit I don't know when the next chapter will come, I know this is a topic I'll be considering more and more, and I'm sure your own thoughts here and in various other web space realms will also help evolve this conversation. All that to say, I welcome anyone who'd like to share this video to Twitter, Reddit, your friendly neighborhood Discord server, or wherever else, and together we can work out where to go from here. I'd also like to go ahead and thank our patrons and coffee givers for this video. If you want to continue to see videos from me, it's only through your contributions that I can make it all possible. Today I'm thanking Al Swigart, Alba, Alex Wenberg, Anna Akrasia, Astral Vagabond, Birayur, Bleep Blaff, Cat Arthur, Do Not Eat, Dill, Emily, Amelia Nace, Good With A Stain, Holy Mittens, James C, Janet, Horver, Jordan Hoxie, Kevin H, Kristen Roars, Lapori Bay, Liz Castro, Matt Mansfield, Matthew Pollock, Mia Nakano, Michael Q. Warnock, Miguel Medina, Nikki Wells, Noah Devlin, Owen Mateson, Pavel A, Peter Coffin, Simrit S, Joe Howell, Sleepy Slug, Stephanie Bullard, Unnamed Muffin, and Vrysha Jairus. With a massive thanks to patrons Brian, Kane Johnson, Colin Johnson, Evie Rosk, Ellie Green, Jimmy Din, Letier, and Nick Schwert. Once more, you're the one that make it all possible. And with that, thanks for watching, love you all, and stay safe.